On the morning after the battle, a white flag rose over Sedan. Inside the French lines, the smoke had not fully cleared. Men who had marched to save an army now stood surrounded, exhausted, and silent. Their emperor, Napoleon III, was no longer commanding a war. He was preparing to surrender himself. This was not just the defeat of an army, it was the moment an empire cracked open. But Sedan was not a simple battlefield disaster. It was not one charge, one mistake, or one unlucky morning. It was a trap, built through movement, delay, terrain, artillery, and command decisions that came too late. So how did Prussia turn Sedan into the place where a French emperor was captured? To understand Sedan, we need to follow the trap before the battle begins. Because the decisive moment did not start when the first German guns opened fire. It began on the roads before Sedan, when the French army was still trying to rescue another French army trapped at Metz. That is the central question of this story. How did Prussia turn a French rescue mission into a battlefield prison and capture Napoleon III inside it? The answer is not simply that Prussia had better soldiers or that France had weaker ones. The answer is more dangerous than that. Prussia controlled time, direction, and space. France kept making decisions inside a shrinking box. In 1870, Europe was waiting for a change in power. France still saw itself as one of the great military and political forces of the continent. Napoleon III ruled the Second French Empire, carrying a name that still echoed from the age of Napoleon Bonaparte. But to the east, Prussia had been rising. Under King Wilhelm I, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, and the military direction of Helmuth von Moltke, Prussia was no longer just another German state. It was becoming the center of a new German power. The Franco-Prussian War would decide more than a border dispute. It would decide whether France could still dominate continental Europe or whether Prussia would replace it. When the war began, France expected speed, prestige, and pressure to work in its favor. But the campaign quickly moved in the opposite direction. The German armies mobilized with discipline. Their corps moved with coordination. Railways, staff planning, and communication turned movement into a weapon. The French army still had brave soldiers and powerful weapons, but bravery does not solve confusion, and a good rifle cannot repair a broken plan. By late August, France was no longer shaping the war. France was reacting to it, and the most urgent crisis was forming around Metz. At Metz, Marshal Bazaine and the Army of the Rhine were trapped. This mattered because Bazaine's army was not a small force that France could simply abandon. It was one of the central pieces of French military power. If Metz fell, France would lose not only men, but also time, confidence, and strategic depth. So another army was formed, the Army of Châlons. Marshal Patrice de MacMahon would lead it. Napoleon III would accompany it. Their mission sounded simple: move toward Metz, link with Bazaine, and restore the French position. But the moment they began that march, the rescue mission became visible to Moltke. And that visibility was dangerous. MacMahon and Napoleon III were not choosing between a good option and a bad one. They were choosing between several bad options. If they abandoned Bazaine, they risked losing a major army and admitting that the campaign had failed. If they moved toward Metz, they risked exposing the Army of Châlons to German pursuit. If they waited, the enemy could tighten the campaign around them. This is how strategic traps often begin, not with one foolish decision, but with pressure that makes every decision costly. The French army moved northeast, trying to avoid the German armies, and then turned back toward Metz. But Moltke understood the shape of that movement. This was the first layer of the Sedan trap. A rescue army has a problem that a normal army does not. It is not fully free. It must move towards someone else. It must think about time, distance, morale, politics, and the fate of the trapped force. That makes its direction predictable. Moltke did not need to know every French order. He only needed to understand the pressure behind those orders. The French wanted to save Metz, so the Germans moved to make that rescue impossible, and to make the rescuers vulnerable. Before Sedan became a battlefield, it was already becoming a direction of travel. Helmuth von Moltke did not think of war as a single dramatic clash. He thought in lines of movement: roads, railways, marching columns, corps boundaries, timetables, communication, the distance between one army and another. To Moltke, the French army was not only an enemy to be attacked, it was a moving object that could be directed, delayed, and enclosed. This was the difference between chasing an enemy and trapping one. A chase follows the enemy's path. A trap changes the enemy's choices until the path leads nowhere. And after Metz, Moltke saw the opportunity. As McMahon's army moved, the German armies shifted north. Their goal was not simply to meet the French head-on, it was to cut across their movement, force them away from Metz, and compress them toward the northwest. The map began to change. The French line of movement stretched longer and more exposed. German columns moved into positions that threatened the roads ahead and the roads behind. This is where the trap became operational. The French still had an army. They still had commanders. They still had weapons. But each march narrowed the space in which those things could matter. Then came Beaumont. On August 30th, the French were struck before they could regain the initiative. The defeat was not only a loss of men and guns, it was a loss of direction. McMahon's plan to link with Bazaine was now collapsing. The Army of Châlons turned toward Sedan, not because Sedan was the perfect place to fight, but because the army needed rest, ammunition, and space to reorganize. That difference matters. A chosen battlefield belongs to the commander. A forced stopping point belongs to the enemy. Sedan was beginning to look less like a refugee and more like the end of the road. Pause here, because this is the tragedy of the campaign. The French had marched to rescue Bazaine, but after Beaumont the meaning of their march changed. They were no longer moving toward a rescue, they were moving away from a broken plan, and behind them the German armies kept coming. In front of them the roads were narrowing, to the side the Belgian border limited the space of escape. The rescuers were becoming the trapped. Sedan was not meant to be a graveyard. To McMahon it offered what his army desperately needed: a place to rest, resupply, and recover after exhausting marches. There was a fortress. There was the Meuse River. There were hills and villages around the town. On paper, these features could offer protection. But terrain is never good or bad by itself. It depends on who controls the exits. It depends on who controls the high ground. It depends on whether an army has time to prepare or whether the enemy arrives first. At Sedan, time was running against the French. Look at the battlefield as a pocket. Sedan sat near the Meuse River. Around it were villages and wooded ground that would become deadly names during the battle: Bazeilles, La Moselle, Floing, the Bois de la Garenne, and the heights near Illy. For the French, these positions could form a defensive shell. But that shell had a weakness. If the Germans moved fast enough to seize the surrounding ground, the French would not be defending from Sedan. They would be compressed into it. The same hills that seemed to offer cover could become German artillery platforms. The same river that helped define the position could also limit movement. This was the geography of the trap. This is one of the most important lessons of Sedan. A defensive position is not strong because it has hills, rivers, or a fortress. It is strong only if the army inside it can still move, communicate, and choose. If it can retreat, it can survive. If it can counterattack, it can create pressure. If it controls the high ground, it can shape the fight. But if the enemy controls the exits, surrounds the approaches, and places artillery above the position, the same terrain becomes a prison. Sedan was not dangerous because it had no defenses. Sedan was dangerous because its defenses could be turned inward. Inside the French command, the question was simple and impossible. Should the army break out? Should it hold around Sedan? Should it continue trying to move toward Metz? Each answer created a new danger. A breakout required speed and unity. The French army was tired and increasingly disorganized. Holding required time to prepare positions. The Germans were already moving around them. Continuing the original mission required a path eastward. That path was disappearing. This is what makes a trap work. It does not remove all choices. It leaves choices that are too late, too costly, or too confused to save the army. The German plan was clearer. Close the ring. Keep pressure on the French from multiple directions. Use the armies not as separate fists, but as parts of one tightening mechanism. Most importantly, bring up the artillery. At Sedan, German guns would become more than support weapons. They would become the walls of the trap. The French needed open space to maneuver. The Germans needed to make every open space dangerous. The French needed a road out. The Germans needed to cover every road with movement, infantry, and fire. By the morning of September 1st, the ring was nearly closed. So when dawn came, where would the first blow fall? The battle opened before dawn. At Bazeilles, on the southeastern edge of the French position, the fighting became brutal and close. Houses, streets, walls, and gardens turned into small battlefields of their own. French troops fought hard to hold the village. German forces pressed in through smoke and fire. This was not yet the whole trap, but it was the sound of the trap closing. Bazeilles fixed French attention and strength on one part of the battlefield, while German forces continued to build pressure elsewhere. For soldiers inside the village, the battle was immediate and personal. For Moltke, it was part of a larger ring. Then the French command structure began to break. Marshal MacMahon was wounded early in the battle. In a battle of maneuver, this would have been serious. In a battle of encirclement, it was disastrous. Command passed to General Ducrot, who understood that the army had to escape while escape was still possible. But almost immediately, authority shifted again to General de Wimpfen, who had different orders and a different instinct. One commander saw the need to retreat. Another pushed toward attack and breakout. The French army was surrounded by the enemy outside and divided by uncertainty inside. This was the worst possible moment for command to become uncertain. An army inside a closing ring needs one clear decision. Break out now, hold and prepare, retreat before the exits close. Each of these choices can work only if the army commits to it quickly. But at Sedan, French command shifted when time mattered most. Orders changed, intentions collided, units received pressure from the enemy and uncertainty from above. This did not mean French soldiers lacked courage. Many fought with extraordinary determination, but courage cannot replace command. And under artillery fire, confusion becomes faster than orders. By midday, German artillery began to dominate the battle. The guns were not firing from one direction, they were firing into a pocket. Battery after battery came into position. From the surrounding heights, German shells reached into French formations, roads, reserves, and attempted rallying points. This was the power of fire combined with encirclement. Artillery did not need to destroy every French unit. It needed to make movement impossible. Every road became dangerous. Every formation became a target. Every attempt to reorganize had to happen under fire. The French army was still fighting, but the battlefield was no longer giving it room to think. Near Flowing, French cavalry charged. It was one of the most dramatic moments of the battle, and one of the most tragic. The riders moved forward into a battlefield already shaped by rifles, artillery, and disciplined infantry. Their courage was visible. Their effect was limited. This is the cruelty of a modernizing battlefield. Heroism could still be real, but heroism could no longer ignore firepower. The cavalry charges did not fail because the men were unwilling. They failed because the structure of the battle had already turned against them. A charge can break a line. It cannot break a ring of artillery, infantry, and terrain. By the afternoon, the French army was no longer acting like one body. It was becoming fragments. Some units fought around Bazeilles. Others were pulled toward La Moncelle. Others were compressed near Flowing and the Bois de la Garenne. Smoke, terrain, artillery, and conflicting orders broke the battlefield into pieces. A commander could still issue an order. But could that order reach the right men? Could those men move? Could they see where the enemy was? Could they find a road that was not already under fire? This was the final tightening of the trap. The French army still existed, but its ability to act as an army was disappearing. This is the heart of Sedan. Prussia did not win by artillery alone. It did not win by movement alone. It won because movement placed the French army inside a pocket, and artillery made that pocket impossible to escape. Encirclement without firepower can leave room for a breakout. Firepower without encirclement can force men to take cover and wait, but together they attack the army's most important ability, choice. The French could not move freely. They could not reorganize safely. They could not concentrate without being shelled. They could not escape without passing through German pressure. At Sedan, the battlefield itself had become a weapon. As the afternoon faded, Napoleon III faced the reality that no imperial title could change. His army was surrounded. The roads were covered. The artillery continued to strike. Breakout attempts had failed. To continue meant more destruction without a clear military purpose. So the emperor chose surrender. A white flag was raised. The man who carried the name Napoleon, a name once associated with movement, victory, and imperial power, was now a prisoner. The symbolism was devastating. At Sedan, France had not only lost a battle, it had lost the image of command. The news from Sedan traveled faster than the smoke could fade. Napoleon III had been captured. The army of Châlons had surrendered. In Paris, the political meaning was immediate. The Second French Empire could not survive the image of its emperor in enemy hands. A new government of national defense was proclaimed, and France continued the war. This point matters. Sedan did not end every shot of the Franco-Prussian War, but it effectively broke the imperial army and destroyed the political foundation of Napoleon III's regime. The battlefield defeat became a state crisis. The state crisis became the fall of an empire. The lesson of Sedan is not simply that one army surrounded another. It is that the trap was built before the final battle. It was built when Metz became a crisis. It was built when MacMahon's rescue mission made his direction predictable. It was built when German armies moved not just to fight, but to cut roads and limit choices. It was built when Sedan became a stopping point instead of a prepared position. And it was completed when artillery turned limited space into deadly space. This is why Sedan matters. It shows that a battle can be decided before the battlefield is fully visible. By movement, by timing, by terrain, by command, and by the loss of choice. Napoleon III entered the campaign hoping to save France's position. He reached Sedan with an army that still had weapons, courage, and men willing to fight. But those things were trapped inside a shrinking space. And once the roads closed, once the guns were in place, once command had fractured, courage could no longer open an exit. Sedan was not only the fall of an army, it was the collapse of a system that had lost the ability to control events. The emperor was captured. The empire fell. And Europe changed with it.